Welcome again to Extremism channel with myself, Mr. J. Bora, and please feel free to subscribe and leave a comment. Today, I really want to talk around a subject of, I would say, real complexity, and has really resulted in a lot of attacks and violence in a lot of places, particularly from a religious context. And that is to do with the subject: does God inspire terrorists? I think this is something that really people are trying to get to grips with in terms of why people justify what they do and the reasons why they do it. Now, there is a book called "The Terror in the Mind of God," and it answers these kind of questions and more. And it has been revised and analyzed. It actually analyzed detail terrorism related to almost all the more world major religious traditions. It talks about the European Christians who oppose Muslim immigrants, American Christians who support abortion clinic bombings and military actions, Muslims in the Middle East associated with the rise of, say, ISIS and Al Qaeda and Hamas, Israel and Jews who support the persecution of Palestinians. It talked about India's Hindus linked to the assaults on Muslims in the state of Gujarat, and Sikhs identified with the assassination of Indira Gandhi, and Buddhist militants, in Maynard affiliated with anti-Muslim violence, and in Japan with the nerve gas attack in the Tokyo subway. Now, this is very, very interesting because if you ask these individuals, they would at some point pretty much say or express or share that yes, they feel God as did, or they have an obligation as being a follower of God in whatever religious view they see or situate themselves to say, I'm doing this for God in order that his voice can be heard or to propagate a message or something else for that matter. Uh, and also for some, they really want to do this in order, I would say, as human beings, because we're dealing with an existential, profound God. Somebody cannot be seen so unless he reveals himself. Someone who we read about in our history, when people have experiences, even in modern day, in the 21st century. But as human beings, our ability to transcend, to have an experience, let's say, a total state of anonymous, is what other individuals are seeking for after engaging, say, in particular Iraq. You see suicide bombers doing this and saying after that they literally shifted off to paradise because of what they've done. And again, there are challenges and in terms of is that the actual case for some religious concern and maybe not others. For example, we see what's in the New Testament, what Jesus taught. Take the beam out your own eye, you can see clearly, and to take the mote out your brother's eye. We talk about hypocrisy. Um, and there's a lot of polarized thinking. There's a lot of views in regards to rational choice theory, strain theory, why people do what they do. But as far as religion is concerned, we've seen it with religious leaders such as Osama bin Laden and others who talked about they answer to God and they could issue fatwas to people based on some religious issues, and a lot of challenges with that in terms of oppression and people interfering in other people's affairs, if we could say it just like that. And far even foreign policy is concerned, and people want to take over and fund state-sponsored terrorism. But really, to bring this into context, what we have to understand is we have to examine God and look at how God is and how, in terms of our development over the years, how He is revealed and how we can understand God in a particular light. Now, again, for example, we talk about how people view the moral character of God, what's God's personality like in terms of his behavior, his nature, his characteristics, and his attributes. These are things that we read in religious books and etc. And then we know even in the Bible, he also talks around some of the three key areas. What even Jesus talked about and went a little bit more further and a bit more depth. He's talked about God is love, God is spirit, and God is light. Again, giving us an indication and an awareness in terms of understanding God in a particular viewpoint. What about God in terms of our likeness and in terms of our functioning, and is that somehow translated towards just give and take the argument of creation? At the beginning, we were made. Remember in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, we talk about how mankind was made, God's image and God's likeness. So there's a lot of issues around our nature. We could talk about psychological views. And innocent, there's a lot of emotion and feelings that fall into in the reasons why we do some that drive us. For example, anger, happiness, sadness, depression. There's a lot of emotions and feelings that come in with this area and probably cause us sort of to engage in areas or acts that we wouldn't have engaged if we were a bit more rational and we had a bit more, say, example, analytical skills to balance something up. But we've seen over the years people have used a lot of narratives and ideologies to justify that God is actually inspiring terrorists to do what they do. Again, the argument being one's man terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Again, depending which camp you situate yourself in, will speak volumes about the reasons of why you believe what you believe and the subsequent actions attached to that. However, we have to take in consideration, as far as all the academic arenas are concerned and views are concerned and research is concerned, some of the strongest sources are recorded obviously in religious books and narratives that are seen. We talk about God, how we dealt with Moses to Egypt, which is viewed, say, from an Islamic perspective and probably from a Jewish perspective, and others as a system that was ungodly, that was oppressive, and God sent Moses in there in saying that he's going to do certain things. And we talk about the plagues and the miracles and the oppression that took place. However, we have to understand that particular story and narrative that God Himself was the one that sent the plagues, and in terms of Moses, wasn't really at the time when he went back in there, going on if I use the word jihad or some physical or brutal regime to oppress and bring down the injustices that were there. And also we can see that reflected also when Moses goes to the mountain and gets the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments that were written by God's finger. There's a difference between, for example, and this is where we need to put things into context. There's a difference between God giving the law to Moses. It's written by the finger of God, is recorded in the Old Testament. And Moses having his laws, which brought, say, death penalties and beatings and stoning, etc., which is what Moses put out there. God's laws, for example, said thou shalt not kill. Again, is a very big argument, and then people interpret that on a particular basis. For a particular reason, say, well, it means this, but in this context, it's justifiable, or from this perspective, in this situation or scenario, it seems to be highly justified. However, we can see that law coming all the way down, and then also we can also use the other argument around when Jesus comes along, Jesus Christ, the Savior, the Messiah, comes along in the New Testament. Yes, he makes reference to some of these points regarding the use of certain violence, what they were doing, an eye for an eye. Now he again changes that and brings a new paradigm, a new dimension into place, which is called grace for the theological and Christian world is concerned. And he talks around, for example, but I say unto you, in his teachings on the Sermon on the Mount, which are recorded in St. Matthew's Gospel, chapter 5, 6, and 7. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that persecute you. So what Moses was doing, he went one step further and says, now I want you to really now go one step further to really display and to demonstrate the practical side of God's nature in terms of our likeness and characteristics, which is very painful to do. It is very, very painful for an individual to sort of be able to pray for someone or hug or love somebody that has caused extensive pain. And that was a real test for mankind, which that law is being here right up into the 21st century. And they are some of the ones that people find very difficult to practice. However, people outside of that, or that seem to contend with that, saying, well, look, I can't do that because of what they're doing to our people. What we see now with Israel and Palestine, with the war that's taking place, and the children that have been killed and people have been displaced, a lot of pain, a lot of anger, a lot of grievances come out. So, and it's going back to some of the reasons and the causes of what drives people or their arguments around, does God inspire terrorists? Again, I'm not really here to quote a lot of academics because some of the arguments for and against, but there are clear indications that God has inspired or been able to be instrumental in winning battles, as we've seen in the Old Testament, particularly with the kings of Israel and Judah, and we see it all in the Old Testament, and he was very instrumental on what to do, how to do it, who to call, who to use. However, as we filter down towards, say, the New Testament, and we start seeing that, and I mentioned other religions that were coming along, we see certain things gradually changing. So when Jesus comes now, he puts a stop to a lot of different things. And incidentally, people will find it very difficult or very weak argument to use Jesus as some sort of central figure who justified the use of brutal violence and terrorism or violent extremism by reason of his nature, his characteristics, which again demonstrates, or we could argue demonstrates to us very clearly God's nature, because there's a verse again in St. John's Gospel 14, chapter 14, verse 6, where he says, he that seeth me seeth the Father. So his very nature and his description, for example, of himself as a lamb, as he was termed, and others, shows to us the indication or the extent or the nature in which he will be actually demonstrating to us and showing to us how we should be in the sight of God. And there is nothing that we can see apart from the New Testament is concerned. Jesus engaged in any act, or even stress for individuals to engage in any violence or form or brutal bloodshed for that matter. That was more confined to, say, the Old Testament, because at the time they would say we could argue theologically even by the law and different aspects until the grace dispensation came along. So therefore, modern day terrorists, and these are terrorist groups that seem to want to indicate to us or stress to us that God actually does inspire terrorists to kill, to behead, to blow up people. We can talk about some of the reasons why and the narratives that drive them people to do what they do. Again, when we compare or contrast it to what some of the views I mentioned earlier, seems to be a very weak argument, or seems to put God in a very bad light in terms of how they view that they see God or these religious figures. Just because someone may pray so many times a day and fast, doesn't that actually give us an indication that that person is close to God? Doesn't that give us an indication that God is pleased with that actual individual? This is another thing, going back to what I said. God does not really seek to promote hypocrites or people with double standards. We talk about double standards. So we really have to view it through a lens that gives us a sort of clearer picture that if God is inspiring these individuals to kill and to do certain things, and in terms of terrorism, then we got a very, very big argument here, and a strong argument to say, well, at what point did God tell them that or show them that? Yes, we could use the argument again. Moses was in the mountain, and he got the mount and got the commandments from God. We saw thunders and lightnings. 2.5 million Israelites saw that when they came out of Egypt. They saw God speaking to Moses. It came down. That was very clear. We know that from our history all over the world. But to what extent, or how can we pattern something similar, say, with Osama bin Laden, the head of Daesh, ISIS, or Hamas, as God actually spoke to him? Now, we could use a lot of different arguments that God is speaking to people in private isolation, but that's not convincing enough. That's not strong enough to bring the argument to the bigger world, to the global world. We're talking about the political arenas and other arenas to suggest that God has actually done this. It seems like God is more salient on issues around terrorism, or religiously inspired terrorism, where people read narratives within the context, within the particular environments that these individuals in, whatever, from Islamic or another point of view. As I mentioned, some of the attacks that took place around the world, whether it's in China or India. But it seems as though individuals within the context seems to put a narrative into a particular situation which does not actually suit or serve the purpose for which that is actually intended. And therefore, we find a very strong discourse. Something seems to be very disorganized, to say the least, in terms of the reason why they're doing it. Now, they may feel, because sometimes it's about feelings, they may think or even believe God is inspiring them to engage or to conduct an act of terrorism on his behalf. However, we have seen God multiple times, and I gave the references in the Old Testament, do things himself through earthquakes or winds or storms, and we can use other things, sicknesses and diseases that he's put onto people, in the sense that to execute a particular judgment. Now, there are certain things that God has to allow. We're talking about God's moral character and his nature and his wisdom and his attributes. God has to allow things to run a particular course before he takes a particular judgment. We've seen that again in the Old Testament, where God told Moses that the iniquity, the Amorites, has not yet been full, it's not yet come to fruition, which is why he could not step in at that particular time. He let it continue. Some things continue, and they're saying the past catches you up. But it seemed as though terrorists, for some reason or another, or some delusion or another, have come along, or violent extremists, and trying to speed up a process that cannot be actually speeded up. Yes, we could argue again theologically, there was a judgment day coming, and certain judgments will take place. However, that is confined, and that again is reserved for God himself, whether he's going to judge angels, individuals, beings for sins or other transgressions, or the lies and everything that takes place. And again, this is also demonstrated within people and human individuals. It seems like hypocrites or people with double standards who don't live pure lifestyles in the sight of God want to represent God, and God is very distinct and very clear, and is very unique in the way that he calls individuals, and he transforms them from one state of a person to another state. Again, we see that reflected with Jesus and the disciples, for example. He calls them out from different backgrounds, one being a tax collector, and Peter was very, very aggressive. He chopped off one of the soldiers' ears when he was in the garden with Jesus, and Jesus picks it up and puts it back on the Roman centurion's ear back onto his into his face, in the sense of his ear. And then what actually happens, he says, put away your sword to Peter. He says, those that take up the sword again will live by the sword, will die by the sword, which is a very significant meaning again, as far as military and terrorism is concerned, why you find a lot of people dying in the way they do. And we could talk about some of the prophecies, for example, in that matter. But the way God really intends for us to reflect and demonstrating is now peace. Now, peace is a very powerful thing. We're trying to get peace through resolution, through United Nations. So peace, then again, is one of the key distinct qualities or attributes of God, particularly when Jesus said, for example, blessed are the peacemakers, not peacekeepers. That's something different. So when you make peace now, in order to sustain that, which again, which one of the titles given to Jesus being the Prince of Peace or the King of Righteousness. So therefore, that being demonstrated to us when he came, was something that needed to be continued. Now, this is the argument, and people arguing over pieces of land, or people arguing over certain doctrines or teachings that have got to be imposed in different places and elsewhere, and challenges. Again, we go back to the argument around, does God inspire that particular individual or that group or that faith or that religion or that country or that city to go on a killing spree, to try and clean places up or cities up or localities up, but through the use of violence and brutal force and fear and intimidation. Again, something that does not really reflect his nature or his characteristics. Because when people serve God or call to serve God, they're not doing it so much out of fear, they want to do it out of love and reverence and respect. This is what draws you to God, especially we see it again demonstrated when Jesus came, about compassion and love and what he was showing to people, saying, look, we don't want to be a hypocrite, we don't want to be doing this, we don't want to be killing people or setting other people up for that matter. We want to be continuing in a particular aspect or nature that continues to please God. So the question being is, if God, they say, is inspiring them to engage in against targets, say, for example, Americans or targeting UK people or citizens, surely then there is a problem there, or there's a severe problem there, because when people are targeting individuals, they are being what we call indiscriminate. They're just killing. We saw it on 9/11. We saw it in July 7/7 bombings. They're just targeting everyone. So therefore, we can see the degree of compassion or the mercy is very limited and very, very, very minute. Give and take, they can quote in the books that God is a God of mercy, God is a God of this, and God is a God of that. So if he's merciful, surely he's not going to target innocent people then. If he's merciful, surely he's going to reserve someone and move them out of the way in order to get to the key root of something. These are things that people don't understand when we're talking around why do people say that God is inspired them. Now, they may read again something from a verse and interpret that particular verse as though they have been sent, summoned, or called, or compelled to engage in that on behalf of God. Not as though God has directly spoken to them by his spirit, like I said with Moses, because, for example, some religions don't believe God can speak to you directly like that. He speaks to you through nature or creation. Give and take, Jesus talks in the New Testament about God's Holy Spirit and how he will speak to individuals, how they're filled with the Holy Spirit. So there is a clear, say, example in Christianity of an existential God, a supreme being, a ruler, talking to individuals, having a clear dialogue, a clear communication. And we've seen that when they would actually pray, as opposed to other religions in modern day that say that God doesn't speak to them, but yet they seem to be quite subjective in their view and argue the fact that they believe or led to believe God has spoken to them, but there's no indication, there's no clear evidence for that, to go engage in a particular brutal, violent act. So therefore, that is another argument in itself to show to us, or even demonstrate to us who are listening, does God inspire these individual terrorists? Then the argument fundamentally could be, no, we could talk about even serial killers who go and kill individuals. Some said they were, told by God or the next person to go and kill their family members because of the evil that they committed. Though during that process or that execution or of what they're doing, surely they themselves engaging in evil to try and eradicate evil. So therefore, we said, like I said earlier, a clear contradiction between one individual saying, God told me to do this, but during the course of that, they themselves are engaging in something that seems to be contrary to God's nature. Have again reading it from how we see God written, like say, for example, the Old and New Testament. We can read and see, well, look, that doesn't really reflect God. He's telling me 1 minute to do something peaceful, to do something in a very mature way, in a very rational way, and at the same time, the same breath, he's telling me to do something totally different. You see our nature conflicts there. We can see there's a clear clear challenge there in terms of some sort of identity crisis, for example. In terms of, we could talk about even going to the depth of our mental health, for example, our well-being is really in a state of confusion because one minute God tells you to do something, next minute He writes it though you shouldn't be doing it. Yet you're the same one trying to please God and saying to God, but you told me to do this. You told me to engage in that act. You told me to go engage in this terrorist group and told me to do this and that, the other. Yet what's written in His book or His holy book doesn't actually state that. So therefore, we have to re-examine again to what extent are these individuals saying, and God Himself is actually inspiring terrorist or violent extremists to engage in such brutality. There seems to be a very stark contradiction there, particularly when God is talking around peace to all mankind. We talk about the season of Christmas and joy to goodwill to all men on earth. Then, to what extent are we saying, or can we then demonstrate God's attributes through us as human individuals? Because if people are professing or claiming to know God, and some of these terrorists do, they pray, they will fast, they do have certain morals, but about the same time, as I mentioned earlier, engage in some brutal act or some severe planning to that extent, because we talk about the mind and how our mind plays a part. So, however, it seems as though if I argue theologically, then what part does the devil play? If he's painted as God is painting God as all the evil and God is doing all the wickedness, then to what extent does Satan do what he has to do by reason of the wars that he's done? Or the people that he's used, we can talk about again in the Garden of Eden and Cain and Abel, how one of them rise up against each other. We see people's nature start to change right from the beginning of creation, and he murdered and killed his brother. Straight after we're talking about Adam and Eve's offspring, we all can again argue the theological argument. There was a war in heaven in Revelation chapter 12, for example, and we see that because Lucifer, who became the devil incidentally, from that religious and theological and biblical perspective, was cast out of heaven. There was a war, so he knows about war. He knows the art of war, the strategy behind war, the skill and depth of war has come to earth, and we see it again demonstrated. So we can see now that these certain aspects and attributes, and God had to kick him out of heaven and tell Michael to get him out of heaven because there's no room for that kind of behavior there. Again, we can see that demonstrated in our homes or lives, certain behavior. There was no room for certain behavior. So we really have to get people to really reconsider and really start thinking again. Why do terrorist or violent or brutal extremists try to say or argue to individuals that this is what God has called them to do, when we can clearly see, as I've clearly explained some of these points briefly, that is actually on the reverse. God is on the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of it's against his nature or his attributes to engage in something in the 21st century, knowing that it could add fuel to the fire. So this is really food for thought for people to consider. Does God actually really, or is he really inspiring terrorists and violent extremists to do what they do? Thank you for watching, and please leave a comment.